joining us here at our first seminar back since COVID-19. We're here in Norfolk, Virginia at Iron Asylum Gym. Thank you so much for coming out. Nobody clapped this time. Yeah, all right, thanks. Thank you for watching on YouTube if you're checking this out. We're going to answer some questions that were submitted during our seminar. Thank you for doing that. If your question does not get answered here, sorry, go to our forum. We'll answer it there. And if that doesn't work, you should hop on one of my Instagram lives every Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll try to answer it there. And if that doesn't work, DM Austin. He's very active and responsive to DMs, particularly ones that go to his unread folder. He's on it. So that works. Okay, let's go through our questions. Question 1. Does intra-workout nutrition make a difference, such as Gatorade or other simple carbohydrates during a workout? You want to start with this? Whatever.
You got it.
All right. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I have some.
But okay, let's start with your thoughts.
So I think we're talking about two different things with those examples, for example. If you're talking about Gatorade versus, or like Gatorade Zero, for example, or simple carbohydrates, because there's some difference with respect to electrolyte content there. And I think for most people who are pursuing regular, just simple resistance training, barbell training, the type of exercise that is, the demands of the exercise typically are not going to make intra-workout carbohydrate supplementation really necessary. I would say a similar thing with respect to the electrolyte concentration for people who are doing just routine barbell-based resistance training like in a gym like this. I think there can be some considerations depending on the environment that the person is in. That would be one thing, and then other specific aspects of their training. So environment, I'll use myself as an example, who routinely trains in an outdoor garage in South Texas, upwards of 110 degree temperatures, 90-minute to 2-hour session, losing substantial or not insignificant amounts of sweat. You could make a point for comparing, if I was just drinking lots and lots and lots of plain water during that session, let's say I ended up needing to drink 2 liters of plain water during that session versus something that had some electrolyte concentration in it, like Gatorade, although I would also argue that the electrolyte concentration of Gatorade is probably too low for that purpose.
Insufficient.
I could make a case for using something that had some added electrolytes, some added sodium, potassium, etc. during that session would be reasonable, knowing that I'm not measuring my blood levels throughout this session, but losing tons of sweat, and I would prefer to replace a similar type of fluid compared to plain water if I'm going to need to use a lot of it. The consequence to drinking lots and lots of plain water is you can actually dilute your blood sodium levels down, a condition called hyponatremia, a few other consequences that are best avoided. Of course, in the course of somebody who's training doing that, it's not necessarily going to be life-threatening in most typical training situations, but you hear news stories every year about, college kids who go through hazing rituals and they drink tons of water until some kid dies or something like that. And so hyponatremia is real and potentially risky. So that would be the point I would make on the electrolyte front. For carbohydrate consumption, again, for regular routine, like our type of barbell training, I think for most people it's not necessary, assuming that you're eating reasonably the rest of the day. You haven't been, fasted for 24 hours when you go to lift, in which case, yeah, you should probably get something in you if you want to perform well during the session. But, myself, I typically eat anywhere from 90 minutes to 3 hours, somewhere in that range, before I train or consume something in that period of time. So I don't find for myself that consuming carbohydrates during the session is necessary. I think probably some folks who do extremely high volume bodybuilding training or something, they may have different opinions on this, but that's kind of outside my scope or what I would want to manage myself.
Yeah, I think for resistance training, when considering adding an electrolyte replacement drink, one, the evidence on this is very underwhelming as far as suggesting any performance improvement, either in the short term or your next session being better. So I don't think I could recommend it based on current evidence. If you prefer the palatability, that way it tastes, right? And you're going to be consuming a lot of fluid because you train in somewhere that's very hot or humid or both, or you sweat a lot. That it seems totally reasonable to me, but I don't know that you need to do that routinely. Main thing that's going to predict how well you do in those situations is what you ate and drank leading up to that, and not just that day, but also the series of days and weeks before that. So they're currently the best fluid intake guidelines we have for athletes are the NATA, North America Training Association guidelines. You guys can check those out if you're watching this online. Put them in the description below, but that kind of outlines the complexities here. So basically, people sweat at different rates, different concentrations of electrolytes, are in different environments, train for different durations of time. So making a, like again, a specific hydration sort of recommendation is impossible. But with respect to performance improvement, like if you drink a Gatorade, will your bench press go up? Like probably not. And then as far as carbohydrates or otherwise eating food during a workout, so again, the data right now on resistance training is not impressive at all. And so from a performance standpoint, would not necessarily recommend consuming food during a workout unless you personally prefer it, which is the same way I feel about timing of like a pre-workout meal. I personally like eating about 2 hours before I work out, but I don't like set a stopwatch after I finish my last fight to say 2 hours, it's now time to lift. That's just how it ends up working on my daily schedule. Other people like to eat a little closer to their workout or even a little further apart. I agree with Austin, as long as you're not fasted, it's a good idea. And then that all kind of goes out the window when we start talking about endurance training, particularly endurance training that's lasting for over 90 minutes, 2 hours or longer than that. There's actually recommendations from the International Sports Society of Nutrition talking about actual carbohydrate recommendations per duration of time. I don't remember what they are offhand, but they actually give like a carbohydrate recommendation, and I think that would be a good place to start if you're an endurance-minded individual. But then I'd have to ask you, like, why are you watching the Barbell Medicine YouTube channel? It's the wrong channel for you.
They still want to get jacked, man.
Yeah, no, it's
okay.
fine. So in relation to your resistance training, like you don't need any goo packs or like, what else would you have? If you were running a marathon and you knew that you needed a snack in the middle, what would be your snack? I know what mine is, but you go first because I know you like answering stuff on the spot.
Well, if you're going to have to consume it while you're running, then I kind of tend to agree that those kind of gel pack things are fairly quick and convenient and easy to throw down instead of something you need to chew.
Sure. Well, one, I'm not a very fast runner. I know this is a surprise to you, and certainly if I'm running a marathon, I'm not moving very quickly. Okay, so
you're going to sit down and have a meal because you may as well.
Yeah, 100%.
You're not winning.
I'm definitely not winning. The whole idea is to finish, and I think I don't want to get sick later either.
Okay.
So for me, it's got to be an Elvis Presley, which is a grilled peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a banana. And that's delicious.
Yeah, that won't work.
Well, I'm not going to run with it, but I wasn't running in the first place. I was already walking.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, probably a beer. It's got a bunch of electrolytes in it, good at rehydrating, and also takes the edge off because I'm like, should I really keep going?
Fair enough.
Yep. Pro tip. All right, question number 2. If hospitalized, should I have somebody bring me whey protein?
I thought this was a funny question.
Not a silly question.
I liked it, yeah.
I mean, so when I was an intern, I did try to routinely order people double protein when I was putting in their nutrition, like Rex. So you have to put in orders for every patient you admit. And for diet, you pick, are they NPO, so they can't eat anything, or is it just, liquids or whatever. I would routinely put in double protein, and every time I would get a page, it'd be like,
the dietitian asking why.
Why? And I'm like, I mean, look, they're at risk for sarcopenia. Like, I feel like this is, and they're like, no, this is wrong. Yeah, I mean, if I was hospitalized, I would try to eat more dietary protein. And I'm not saying that just because I'm like, protein or gains. It's just the thing is, the risk of like critical illness, myopathy, bed rest and its effect on your anabolic resistance, all those sort of factors, in addition to not training, would all put you at a much higher risk for losing muscle tissue. And for most folks, especially those who don't have like a profound amount of extra muscle tissue to lose, having a concentrated source of dietary protein that is available to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and is also relatively low in calories and is easy to consume seems like a good deal. So if you can't get it in the hospital, because they would give you Ensure or something, or Boost or something like that,
yep,
which is effectively a protein shake that is low in protein.
with plenty of sugar in it.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's got calories, and so people can consume that. And I'm not saying that it's bad universally. I'm just saying that if you're there, if you're going to have the Ensure, like I want the extra 20 grams of protein too. Yeah. So get you some whey.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable. On the other hand, the counter argument that I make frequently when we're talking about in-hospital diets, because I am involved in making these decisions frequently,
Sure.
is that it's unlikely to make a big difference on people's long-term outcomes when most hospital stays are not going to be particularly long.
Sure.
If you're in an unfortunate situation where you're in the hospital for like 3 months, then sure, I can make an argument that it's going to make a big difference there. But I'll frequently, majority of the patients that I admit to the hospital are going to be in the hospital for, 3 days or less, most of them, and fewer are going to be there longer than that, and then the fewest are going to be there for like weeks to months on end. So somebody who's going to be in the hospital for a day or 2 days or 3 days, we're going to say, oh, they have heart disease, so we're going to put them on a heart healthy diet for a day in the hospital. I'm like, that doesn't really do anything. So I tend to not be super picky about that, because ultimately what it ends up doing is just restricting the patient's choices when they're in the hospital and they're already miserable enough. And there's no sense in my mind torturing them for something to give them like 2 meals that fit this criteria that really. So the bigger deal would be if we could get them to consume sufficient dietary protein in the weeks, months, and years leading up to the hospitalization. Yep. So they're super jacked when they go to the hospital, and they're at lower risk of in-hospital mortality, and arguably they don't need to potentially go into the hospital at all if the condition could have been averted. So I think that's far more important than worrying about an in-hospital diet, because most hospital stays are relatively short. But to the extent that you're going to be there for a while, as long as you don't have any reasons not to feed somebody's gut, then sure, you can give them some protein if they're going to be there for a while.
If you were going to be in the hospital for 7 days, you taking some whey? Maybe.
I'm not going to be going out of my way to get it though.
No, but Lorraine's bringing you some whey. Probably that strawberry junk that you keep in the back of your pantry. Yeah, I know. What would you recommend for managing/receiving feedback on pain in the clinical world so as not to ignore patients' perceptions but still maximize the rehab process?
I can start.
All right.
So this was the reference where I was talking about how if you're a coach and you're coaching somebody who has some discomfort, say in their back, after every rep or after every set, and you're asking, how's your back feel? How's your back feel? How's your back feel? Constantly drawing more attention to that area, because we know that attentional focus plays a big role in people's experience of pain. And so I would make the recommendation to not do that when you're coaching people. This isn't to swing the other way and to say just to ignore any symptom that they report, but you don't necessarily need to go fishing for that. In a rehab context, if you are a skilled clinician and observer and communicator with your patient, then you can observe what they're doing and then just ask them what their thoughts are after a given set. How'd that go? Do you feel comfortable increasing the load? Something like that. And given that you've had the discussion, the education process ahead of time, saying we're going to work in a range of tolerable symptoms and aim to progress gradually from there, then you can get that feedback. They can volunteer it to you rather than you go and fishing for it from them. So to the point where if they're feeling comfortable and okay, then you can celebrate that and say, that's awesome, that's great news, you're feeling good, that's a good sign, we can keep progressing in this process. Whereas if they volunteer that this is pretty uncomfortable, or I'm concerned about this, or this is freaking me out, or I don't want to go up anymore, then you can respect that and maybe have a discussion around it and modify the plan accordingly, rather than constantly going again fishing and drawing their attention to an area that their attention may not necessarily be on. Focusing their attention more on the task and celebrating the victory of that went well, I think is probably the way that I would go in a clinical context. I recognize, however, that in the clinical world there's some tendency and potentially even rules and requirements to get patients' pain scores on a scale of 1 to 10, and that can be annoying, but you don't need to do a pain score on a scale of 1 to 10 after every set either. So I would do the bare minimum on that front as far as getting your pain scores, and then just focusing on the task and not unnecessarily drawing attention to where it doesn't need to be.
Yep. I think just a practical sense, I actually don't recommend that most coaches ask about it. You can, if you notice somebody who's demonstrating pain-related behavior, which during a lift would be some sort of like slowdown that occurs like during the descent of a squat, for example, or like hesitation during a particular lift that is abnormal because you've worked with this person before, you can ask like, hey, was that painful for you? Or you can ask them even a more open-ended question, like what's going on, just to get them to start talking about it. But my general recommendation is to not ask, does that hurt, after any set. The only time I think that's appropriate is if you're trying new stuff to try to work around an existing injury, and you're kind of like literally on the fly trying new things to see if they're still sensitive to that particular movement. So if someone had low back pain, like Leah, when we were training together in Santa Cruz quite frequently, if she had like a low back pain, we'd do like a mid-shin rack pull, and I would, after she did a set, I'd be like, how'd that feel?
How'd that feel is the right question there, I think.
Yeah. And then if that didn't, if she's, said, it's still pretty sensitive, it's still aching pretty good, we try another thing, and I would say, again, how does that feel? Something like that.
Yep.
I think, the big thing that people, I don't know if they feel this way, but I certainly think it gets perceived this way. It's like, you have to be perfect with this pain stuff. Like, and if you mess up, like, dang it, I ruined it.
Yeah.
And it's not the case. Like, we're all humans, we all make mistakes, we all say the wrong things sometimes. The important part is to not compound an error with another error. Like, oh, did that hurt? And you're like, oh no, I said the H word. Oh, dang. Now you're freaking out about it, and they're like, what? And so some of that actually gets transferred to them, and they're like, they start feeling guilty about having pain, a normal human experience, and then the stuff can start kind of snowballing. And so I think it's just like, yeah, look, we all make mistakes and don't use the right language all the time. We have certain goals for how we communicate, and let's try to do the best we can. But in the coaching setting, I think it just plan on saying, how does that feel? If you notice something strange.
Yeah.
Is it ever
this was an interesting one,
worthwhile to seek treatment for chronic, non-specific pain? Yes. Well, I think it's worthwhile to seek treatment for pain, period. I assume this question probably means like use of pain medications, but I'm not going to say that means treatment. So treatment would be seeing a clinician, being evaluated for potential causes of pain, involving the patient, exploring this biopsychosocial model together, coming up with a shared management plan, and moving forward from there. So I would say if a person has pain and they're concerned about it, you should see your medical professional. If it's from training, my caveat would be hopefully they're very familiar with pain science, and unfortunately I don't feel confident that is the case. I'm not trying to throw shade at the medical establishment. It's just, look, I'm in the medical establishment and I know that that's the case right now. So I think like our pain and rehab specialist team, those guys are the best in the business, and that would be my general recommendation for somebody who's got pain from training and they're like, I need some professional help.
Yeah. But
I think if somebody has pain that concerns them, they're worried about a specific thing, they're like, oh, I have this low back pain, I'm worried it could be cancer. It sounds crazy to some, but that's not an unusual sort of report. It's like, oh yeah, my dad had the same sort of pain and he had cancer, and that's why I'm afraid. Seeking treatment, because you're going to be evaluated and then treated based on findings, and then again, you as the complex patient, ideally, that would be a net benefit. I don't know that you need pain medications necessarily, which I assume is, again, what this question actually meant.
I don't know what it implied.
Yeah.
When I read the question, I said, I hope I didn't convey the message during my lecture that it's not worth seeking help for pain-related issues, because that's certainly not the case.
Yeah, in fact, the opposite.
Yeah, it's very common for people to need help. I think that we definitely provided you with information, education to hopefully empower you to self-manage many of your like common routine day-to-day aches and pains type situations. But to the extent that you're dealing with something, a pain-related issue that maybe you don't fully know what to do, or you've tried what you've learned and you can't make progress, then seeking out some consultation, evaluation, some assistance from somebody you trust would be a fantastic idea. Now, we cannot guarantee what that person will do, will offer you, will recommend to you, unless it's somebody from our own rehab team. I've definitely seen patients who end up seeing a pain specialist or something, and bad things end up getting ruled out and they get a prescription for an opioid. That probably wouldn't be the case that I would go with this myself, nor would it be the way that our rehab team would go. So we have a resource that we can offer that we trust and recommend without reservation. But if you are struggling with an issue like this, then seeking help is definitely the way to go. Would recommend.
Would recommend, yes.
All right. How can we do a better job of framing exercise and diet in a positive light for our youth? For example, it's somewhat common practice for parents to not let their children leave the dinner table until they've finished all their vegetables. Another example of this would be coaches making their athletes run as a form of punishment. These experiences may frame healthy eating and exercise as a way that is synonymous with suffering and discomfort. How can we improve these psychosocial variables early and or address them with adults that have already met these experiences, or lived these experiences, excuse me. I picked some hard ones this time.
I mean, it's not. It's just I don't necessarily agree with the premises. So, for example, like I don't know that one may necessarily associate this with like a form of punishment. Like you might, but it depends on other stuff. Like I don't know, was your parent yelling at you, go run because whatever, or like, hey, let's go run around the house. Like let's go do a lap.
So maybe that's your suggestion, is the way that the recommendation or the way it's framed matters.
Yes, it does, exactly. So for example, and I'm not pretending to give anybody parenting advice. Like there's a few pieces.
Neither of us should do that.
Parenting advice, relationship advice. Like look, I'm not your doctor for that. Like I think so. One, I always think that the parents leading by example probably makes for a better environment, especially for making recommendations or suggestions to their kids, because mom and dad are already doing it, and so you should do it too. And then also if needing to modify some of the behaviors that the child is engaging in, especially with respect to diet or activity, the way that you're recommending them should be ideally in a form of positive way or affirming way, rather than like do this, in a negative light, because I think it's just too many risks there with potentially future psychological distress around those actions. But trying to get kids to eat vegetables, for example. So one, like you guys should, as a family, should be eating vegetables regularly, and involve the kid in preparing the vegetables and picking the vegetables and how to, which way shall you prepare them? Like all that stuff would be useful, because then the kid's got to buy into these vegetables. Like, look, I helped make these, and then they're probably going to eat them. With respect to being active, like, hey, do you want especially I know the parents I know that train, if they train at home, their kids want to come out into the gym and play around with mom and dad who are lifting in the gym. And so exposing them rather early on can be a positive experience, rather than say, hey, get out of my hair, go run around the house. Not saying that that's how people do it, but I think that leading by example, and then also involving the kid in the process, like whatever process, can be useful, because then they have a bigger buy-in. Oh, you just got a home gym, or you're building a home gym, like, yeah, let's set it up together, where should this go? All this other sort of stuff can be useful. As far as adults that have already had these experiences, I think you're gonna suss that out during this, the sort of interview process, when you're taking in a new client, asking them, what sort of barriers do they have, or feelings or thoughts do they have about changing their dietary patterns. And if something specific comes up, that's when you're gonna get there. But I don't routinely see that, to be honest. I have, the closest I get is people who say, I don't like vegetables.
Yeah.
And then when I explore that, it's usually due to like, I don't like the way they taste. I don't, and then I'm not really sure how to prepare them in a way that is tasty. And so then we just go down and kind of try things. If I could give advice to parents who have kids, it'd be to get them to be active in as many different ways as possible. And the best way to do that is not only giving them choices and opportunities, but also leading by example. So if mom and dad lift or otherwise are active, like it's highly likely the kid's going to want to join in on that.
It's just the normal thing to do.
Yeah.
I don't have a ton to add to that. I was going to say, that's kind of why I included this question, was mainly to convey the message of leading by example is going to be kind of the main thing that I would suggest here. For adults who have already been through this, refer back to the standard behavior change talk that we did. All the same things would apply there as far as how you work with people to change their behaviors. That's the idea.
Did your dad lift?
No.
You know where my dad and my mom met?
At the gym?
Yep.
There you go.
My mom was an aerobics instructor, and my dad was playing racquetball, and apparently short shorts meets short shorts.
Nice.
Yeah, that's how I came to be. Okay. Should the elderly be prescribed anabolic steroids?
So there are actually some situations where anabolic steroids have been researched for medical use. This includes severe burns, because burn patients, whole body burns and things like that, is a major hypercatabolic state. So there's some research in that world. And other syndromes where there is severe muscle and fat wasting, a syndrome called cachexia. So anabolic steroids have also been researched in HIV, AIDS related cachexia, where these patients are just literally skin and bones, they've wasted away. So this is being looked at. I think part of the reason, outside of the obvious social stigma around this stuff, that they're not kind of used more liberally in practice, is actually when you look at the available research that we have on this stuff in elderly patients, the outcomes are actually not mind-blowingly good.
Yes.
And so I think that until such point as that evidence would emerge, where we put an elderly individual, presumably sarcopenic individual, not just somebody who's elderly for the sake of it, on anabolics, if we see fantastic results in terms of quality of life or other kind of positive outcome measures, then I wouldn't expect medical societies or organizations to recommend this stuff until we have a solid evidence base to stand on. I think a big part of it is that doesn't actually exist yet, and I'm actually open to the possibility that they may not deliver the benefits that we all assume they would. Rather, I think that we should pull the levers that we know work right now, getting physical activity up and getting the nutritional intake to where it should be. And I definitely think it's reasonable for us to research this stuff. But going back to the root of the question, should the elderly be prescribed anabolic steroids? At this time, no. Wouldn't be my recommendation, because we don't have clear evidence of consistent benefit, whereas there is some potential for harm, particularly in elderly who, again, remember the number one cause of death in the US and the world that I talked about on day one yesterday is cardiovascular disease. And there are cardiovascular risks associated with these medications if you were to give them to patients. So we're giving them medications with some known risk from a cardiovascular standpoint, and potentially other organ systems that can be involved. There can be side effects on the liver, depending on the type of anabolic steroid and the route of administration, as well as on the kidneys, and a few other potential side effects and complications for unclear benefit. So we need research to demonstrate clear benefit before we're going to comfortably prescribe it. And that really stands, in my opinion, for any medical intervention that we're going to do. I would prefer to have good evidence of benefit before I do it. And that has been particularly relevant recently with COVID when it comes to deciding how we're going to treat these patients. Yeah, I want good evidence before I decide to give somebody a particular medication that has known risks and unknown benefits.
Yeah, I feel similarly, mainly with respect to the, obviously the risk-benefit analysis, but with the existing data on this. If there was robust data showing when you give elderly patients testosterone, they grow huge muscles and their quality of life improves and all this other stuff improves, then I think it would already be widely adopted. Right now you have relatively few amount of studies, particularly looking at muscle wasting and muscle and fat combined wasting diseases. So like Austin said, HIV, burn patients, other diseases that causes cachexia like liver disease, etc. And then a few fringe papers that randomly pop up, like using testosterone in women who have chest pain, like angina.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah.
It was weird.
Or now the most recent paper that came out on this is testosterone use in depression. And there's other papers obviously out there on testosterone, but much fewer on other anabolic agents, right? So when people are talking about oxandrolone or Anavar or decadurabolin or whatever. This is the same case that SARMs, the selective androgen receptor modulators, these are the new drugs that are on the street. Well, they're on the street right now, but they're being researched. These are effectively, they're supposed to be like steroid analogs, work like steroids, but have none of the side effects because they're selective for the receptors that they actually bind to. But unfortunately, during the phase 2 clinical trials, when they're using them on these older people, they're not getting the benefits that are purported, like bigger muscles, stronger muscles, being able to, be more active or anything like that. And so when you have this data that overall suggests not a reliable benefit, and then there are known risk factors, it makes sense that the medical community is kind of ooh. Even during our boards prep, I remember on step 1, there was a question about using anabolic steroid, a patient who was using anabolic steroids, and then one of the lines was, data at present does not show or shows that anabolic steroids don't provide a performance benefit in sport. Please counsel the patient accordingly. And I was like, oh, Vinny down the street at Gold's might have a different opinion.
Yeah.
So as far as how this works in the future, I think if better data comes out, that'd be useful. In order to get that better data, we need to do more studies. And I think that in general, medicine is fairly liberal leaning. And so as new data emerges, I don't know that any stigma is going to prevent us from adopting the latest practices, provided that ample evidence exists.
There was a big series of studies that came out, I think maybe last year or 2 years ago, called the testosterone trials. It was a big set of multiple studies on testosterone for various outcomes. So if you're interested in this topic, I'll just look those up and get some results.
Yep. All right. Related, does a strength athlete ever achieve enough hypertrophy? Is there a point in the athlete's development where there is no longer a need to make the muscle larger and only to make them stronger? It's a complicated question. So enough hypertrophy. I mean, that's like saying, you ever get jacked enough? You ever make too much money? I mean, I don't know that you can say yes to that. So as far as in an athlete's development where they no longer need to make the muscles larger and only need to make them stronger, that assumes that these happen like independently. And I don't know that I view them as like two independent processes. I think that the amount of muscle mass increase that co-occurs with strength increase, particularly at high level strength athletes, is much smaller than what occurs in like physique athletes, bodybuilders, etc., who are like primarily just training for size increases and not at all for strength increases. But I think that there's still some hypertrophy occurring nonetheless, even if it's relatively small. Now that being said, the actual hypertrophy process is rather complicated as far as like, does the myofibrillar hypertrophy, just the contractile protein, does that precede some of this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which tends to create a more substantial increase in muscle cross-sectional area? Or does the one precede the other? That stuff's still being sussed out. And so this is still an active area of research. But from a practical standpoint, I think trying to get as jacked as possible using, while still doing the specific exercises, the specific for your sport, and the correct intensity ranges to make them go up would be the goal. I don't ever think you say, I'm jacked enough, I'm gonna cut the volume down.
Yeah, last part of this question where it says there's no longer a need to make the muscles larger and only to make them stronger, I think that creates kind of an artificial dichotomy or separation between those two things, when really, at least there is, to be fair, some debate in the research world about how much hypertrophy contributes to strength development and performance. But I tend to lean on the side, and I think you probably do too, that strength performance of a particular muscle, one of the contributing factors to that strength potential is muscle size. The other major contributor would be the neurological, like the skill, the recruitment kind of aspect of it. And so you can't really say, I don't need to make the muscle larger and only to make it stronger, when muscle size is probably a contributor to muscle strength. And so I think that to the extent that you want to continue making your muscles stronger, you should strive to make them larger as well. And I don't think there's actually a way for you to aim to make them stronger without generating some amount of hypertrophy along the way in the process. Number 7, is liposuction ever a good idea? And I think a context for this question, you can view this question in a couple different contexts. One is in the context of our discussions all weekend here with respect to health. So I would kind of think back to when we talked about obesity and the situations where carrying excess body fat can be problematic. And in particular, we talked about how tight of a relationship there is with the abdominal waist circumference and medical complications. And the reason why there's such a close relationship there is because that measurement reflects intra-abdominal, or what we call visceral body fat accumulation inside the abdomen, inside the organs, inside the liver, for example, which is different. Visceral body fat or adipose accumulation is a bit different than subcutaneous, or body fat that accumulates under the skin. And so when body fat or adipose is infiltrating your abdominal organs, your liver, your pancreas, things like that, that's when we see big time increases in diabetes risk, cardiovascular risk, things like that. Whereas liposuction as a treatment primarily removes subcutaneous body fat, not the kind that's inside, not the kind that's in the liver. So there's actually some data on this. There's a small study that I found while I was prepping for this, where they took a group of women, some of whom had diabetes and some of whom did not, all of whom had excess body fat, and they performed serial large volume liposuction, removing large amounts of subcutaneous body fat. You're gonna say something?
What if you just move it?
Put it someplace else?
Yeah.
I don't know why you would do that.
Okay, all right.
And they serially removed this subcutaneous body fat, and then when they looked at how they did afterwards, they did find that their waist circumference went down as a result of removing body fat, obviously. Their leptin levels went down, and leptin is a hormone that is high when you have lots of body fat and low when you have less body fat, so that obviously went down. That all makes sense. When they measured their actual levels of insulin resistance and their cardiovascular risk factors, things like blood lipids and things like that, there's no change. So from a health standpoint, I do not have a good case to make for liposuction. If you say, is it ever a good idea? Well, that's strictly up to you from a cosmetic standpoint. At that point, I would not recommend it for medical benefits. If there is excess body fat that needs to be dealt with invasively or surgically, and there are medical issues going on, or even if there aren't and you meet criteria based on the criteria that we talked about yesterday, I would say real bariatric surgery is far more beneficial from a health standpoint than liposuction would be, because we talked about how the long-term 20-25 year follow-up of patients who get bariatric surgery, they have much greater and much more sustained weight loss and health benefits. Like, you can cure diabetes in like a couple days after getting bariatric surgery. It just like goes away, which is pretty wild. Whereas liposuction does not have any of those benefits outside of cosmetic effects.
Yeah, I think if for whatever reason you're getting like visceral liposuction,
Don't think that's
liposuction, yeah, maybe that. Or if the liposuction would somehow improve adherence to other lifestyle changes, if you felt like I'm going to pay for this procedure from an aesthetic standpoint, or because I feel like it's going to jumpstart my progress, and that's really going to help keep me motivated, and it does as far as improving adherence to a health promoting dietary pattern and exercise, like cool. But if you're just like moving it around, you know, from like front to back, I don't know that that's the move.
How do you guys personally take care of your mental, emotional energy?
I think that anybody who's involved, particularly in the healthcare fields, you know, there's a difficult balance between like taking care of yourself, the person, and then caring for others. But you went into this field to take care of others, and some days are harder than others, and you give more than you get, and other days you get more than you give. As far as how an individual needs to approach their own particular needs from like a mental health standpoint, I think services that are underutilized are mental health services. If you feel better talking to a counselor or some sort of psychiatrist, that can all be useful. Me personally, I have found reasonably good sort of balance, if you will, by trying to maintain a set of boundaries that works for me. Meaning that it's pretty easy to get kind of really involved in somebody else's sort of, like, this is their journey and this is how I'm helping them, and these are all their issues that we're kind of working out. But I have to also step back and understand that's not my particular situation, and in addition, it's maybe not okay if they're emailing me 5 or 6 times a day. And so creating those boundaries where, hey, this is the expectations that we're setting as far as communication, like frequency, style, what I can be responsible for. But I think overall, having some sort of boundaries, like professionalism boundaries, are useful. I think also kind of understanding the field that you're getting into, kind of expect some of this, and then using like mental health services would also be useful. Like, counselors need counselors. It's very underutilized. This is underutilized, and then I don't know that there's any reliable, like a specific approach that I think universally works for all folks. So finding your kind of stuff that makes it viable for you can be useful.
I mean, burnout is super common in medicine, and among some specialties more than others. I get to see horrible things very frequently, and burnout is common around me as well among kind of fellow clinicians. So I definitely agree with everything that Jordan said with respect to professional boundaries outside of work, for example. If you feel like you're having issues from a mental health standpoint, using those kind of resources. As far as my own personal habits on this front, this is a big part of why, people say, how is it that you've gone like a decade and missed 1 week of training? It's like, well, this is why I make sure that I train, because for me personally, that is my most useful way to maintain some kind of control over my life, some aspect of consistency, something that I enjoy, that I can look forward to. Whenever I do end up getting out of the hospital, whether it's early or late, I plan to train regardless and don't skip that session, even if it's 10 or 11 at night. I did that plenty of times in residency, because that gave me a sense of continued control over my life. That's a big part, is if you feel like you're not in control, right? So loss of self-efficacy over your situation, loss of autonomy, that can be a big deal. And then similarly, if you're a coach, biting off more than you can chew can be a big problem, right? In terms of your client load, for example, something that you actually do have control over. There was a period of time when I was in residency where I was doing similarly, like multiple jobs like I do right now, but with respect to residency, I did not have control over my life. I had to be in the hospital at certain times. and responsible for whatever was going on there at that particular time. And then I had these other things, coaching and some telemedicine stuff I was doing outside that I did have some control over, but I definitely bit off more than I can chew. And I cracked pretty hard around that period of time. Recognized that I bit off way more than I could chew, but at the same time, I knew that I was still training, and I knew that it was temporary, and that it wasn't going to be like that forever, right? And so ultimately, fortunately, was able to get through that and have other things that I can kind of look forward to and enjoy. But I've definitely am currently in a period of time where I'm actually trying to scale back a little bit of how much I'm doing, because I'm like, do I really need to be doing this much right now, as far as all the things that I tackle and work on at the same time? And the very clear and obvious answer is no, despite the fact that I still do them. So definitely easier said than done, and I don't have it perfected either. But everything Jordan said, as well as paying attention to your workload to the extent that you have control over it. If you have more control over it, that's awesome, and scaling back if you need to. And my bias is definitely training, as far as some measure of consistency and constancy, and something I do have control over. That may be something different for you, and take advantage of that, whatever that may be.
How are lipid panels affected by dieting? So in general, let's talk about after you've lost weight, right? So you've dieted and lost weight, and then we'll talk about what happens while you're actively dieting. So after you lost weight, usually a 5 to 10% weight loss produces about 10 to 15% reduction in LDL, and maybe a little bit greater reduction in triglycerides, which can be useful, particularly if you were carrying too much body fat before. If you lose more weight, you can see a greater decrease in those numbers, right? So if you lost 20% body weight, you may see an even greater decrease in your LDL and your triglycerides. And in general, HDL tends to stay the same. If you start exercise at the same time, HDL may even increase. Overall, good. Now, the nuance here is that if you were a candidate for statins prior to losing weight, meaning that your 10-year risk of having a bad outcome, so your 10-year risk of having a heart attack or a stroke or something like that was high, and you were a good candidate for statins, the treatment goal for LDL reduction is 50%.
50.
Reduce your LDL by 50%. And so if the average amount of LDL reduction you can expect by reducing your body weight 5 to 10%, which is a pretty substantial weight loss, right, is 10 to 15%, you're not getting there. You're less than 3 times less than that minimum threshold. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't even try to lose weight, just take the statin, support Big Pharma. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that we should not avoid medications when they provide clear benefit. And it doesn't mean that the person maybe necessarily needs to be on a statin forever. It's just to reduce that risk substantially going forward. Maybe that's the initial movement. What happens to the lipid panel while you're actually dieting, you can think about this as the body fat. You're actually liberating a lot of stored fat into the bloodstream, and you're using it for fuel. And so a blood test, particularly a cholesterol test, is a snapshot in time of how much fat is in your blood, how much fat is being carried around by certain proteins in your blood. And so let's say then you stick the needle in the vein, pull out the blood. Oh crap, there's way more fat in your blood at this particular time. It's like, well, yeah, it's on its way to the muscle tissue to be oxidized for fuel, for example. And so you see that all the time, that people, their triglyceride levels will be significantly elevated while they're losing weight. Sometimes even their LDL will be elevated while they're losing weight. It usually doesn't happen after you've lost weight and your weight has plateaued, but certainly during weight loss. So the recommendation for lipid panel intervals is every 6 months, I believe, after you've initiated it, although some clinicians will do 3-month intervals. When I was actively seeing patients and somebody was trying to lose weight, and for lifestyle, we were trying lifestyle recommendations initially, I would effectively try to schedule that second lipid test till after a period of time where we're giving them to lose weight and then maintain it. Meaning that if it's going to take you more than 3 months to kind of lose the weight, I would extend the interval time so that you are weight neutral, maintaining your weight, your new lower weight, before I got another lipid test.
Yeah, I don't think there's a great reason to check lipid panels super frequently, regardless. I mean, definitely every 3 months is I think too frequent to be super useful. I would just not check blood tests while you are actively, aggressively trying to lose weight, and then check things, that after things have stabilized. So.
Yep. a new client reports eating below their total daily energy expenditure, but isn't losing weight, what do? I imagine we can't instantly correct underreporting. Specifically, do you still prescribe an amount of calories that should result in weight loss per the NIH if they report a total daily energy intake lower than the prescription? So basically, somebody's saying, I'm eating these calories, but I'm not losing weight, what do? So just like I was talking about in the nutrition lecture yesterday, if the first you check the adherence, right? So it's like, hey, look, are you sticking to this plan? And they say yes. And you're like, okay, cool. And so you're taking them at their word, and they're not losing weight at that calorie level, I would reduce calories. End of story. If you do that again and they're still not losing weight, I kind of go through the same process again. We've just reduced another 250 to 500 calories. They're reporting being very adherent and still not losing weight. At that point, when I check for adherence, so let's say 2 weeks have gone by, they still haven't lost weight, I ask them, hey, how's your adherence been? Any issues? We talk about it. I usually ask for proof. Not in a way like I'm being an investigator here or interrogating them, but I want to see like their MyFitnessPal log or however they're tracking their food or something like that, just to kind of make sure like, you know, that they're counting things correctly, there's not some sort of error. I also check for things that people don't tend to count, certain condiments, sugar sweetened beverages, alcohol, stuff like that. Things that people have trouble logging. They're like, yeah, I don't log any of my Cokes because it's liquid. So you'd be surprised. And you know, this obviously happens sometimes, otherwise I wouldn't have the story, but that alcohol and condiments tend to be like the three biggest offenders there for things that people don't track, and then snacks. So it's like, you know, are you snacking on stuff in between meals? And you know, again, this is all in the context of somebody who's trying to lose weight, and we've just lowered calories and it still doesn't work. And so if nothing appears odd there, then I lower calories again. I'm not averse to continuing to lower calories unless I suspect there's this really big adherence issue, you know. Now, obviously, we had a client for a while who was, you know, over 200 pounds and then was reporting not losing weight at 1,200 calories, but reported 7 out of 7, you know, every day. She was very adherent. And I was like, well, let me see. I'd love to see the MyFitnessPal, you know, reports. And she's like, oh, yeah, they're on my phone. I don't know how to get them to you. And I was like, well, yeah, you just take them screenshots. I just want to see them, to see what you're eating. It's like, it seems like a long process. Like, I don't know that I can get them to you. There was some resistance, and I got it. And so the whole thing wasn't to be like, gotcha, ha ha ha. You know, this is the issue. The thing was like, well, let's address the actual problem, right? What are the issues? You know, what sort of barriers do we have to adherence? And we had an even barrier to admitting there was a problem with adherence. And so again, the thing isn't gotcha. The thing is, all right, we have an issue here. How do we address the communication thing first, and then figure out strategies to overcome the adherence issue? So that's how I address the issue, and just some common things that I've seen over time. Austin, you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right. How can you best mitigate the effect of shift work, like 24-hour shifts, such as naps to catch up on sleep? And then how do you not nocebo yourself into thinking you'll have a bad day because you didn't get enough sleep or some other factor that is far from ideal?
I can start.
Yeah, all right.
So this is something that I think both of us have some experience with, having been through periods of time where we did 24, 28-hour shifts somewhat regularly. And there's not a great way to get, you know, quality sleep during that period of time, particularly when those shifts can be unpredictable. So there may have been some of those shifts where I was able to get some sleep during the shift. There are some where I had to be awake, alert, and doing things the entire time. And obviously there ends up being a consequence afterwards. Some of those days after the shift, you'll crash harder than others, or if you end up getting some sleep on the shift, maybe you don't sleep as much. And so the unpredictability, the variability is problematic. It results in you generally not feeling awesome. And I think that is unfortunately probably part of the deal with doing 24-hour shifts with any degree of regularity. You're not going to feel completely awesome or completely normal all the time. If they're more spaced out and relatively infrequent, then you can try to get on as consistent of a sleep schedule as you can in between, and that'll restore some semblance of normalcy. But just the idea with sleep in general, and this should be the takeaway if you listen to our podcast on sleep that we did with our friend, Dr. Gordon, is that consistency is kind of what tends to be the name of the game here. In particular, if we can get, like our patients who we have with insomnia, if we can get them waking up at the same time every single day, then that ends up resulting in developing sufficient sleep drive over time, such that they end up kind of falling into a more normal sleep-wake cycle, a rhythm. But obviously this is a big barrier to having a consistent sleep schedule. You just have to do the best you can in terms of consistency. As far as the other part of the question, where it had to do with not kind of crushing yourself by thinking you're going to have a bad session just because you didn't get enough sleep or some other factor, I think this comes into the discussion I had earlier comparing external versus internal load. So external load being the absolute weight on the bar, whereas internal load describes the response to that training stimulus that we measure using RPE. I think that for people who have excessive focus on the importance or the significance of the external load, they put all their value and self-worth on the absolute weight on the bar, I think you're going to have some trouble with this situation, right? Because you're going to put so much value on lifting a particular weight on a particular day at a particular time, and your life, the cards are just not going to fall that way. You're going to get to that day, that time, go to lift that weight, and maybe it doesn't go, right? And that's tough. That's why we like having more, as Jordan said, malleability, flexibility in your training program, where you view the training process differently. You don't view the training process as something where you have to lift a specific weight. Rather, you're saying, the weight on the bar, the reps I'm doing, is merely a strategy to elicit this response that I'm trying to get, right? And in that sense, you can change the weight on the bar and not freak out about it. Rather, you can pat yourself on the back for saying, I got the desired stimulus for where I am today at this particular time based on how I'm performing at this moment, given everything else in my life that I may or may not have control over, right? So it can almost become a win when you go into that session. You use your auto-regulation strategy like RPE, you adjust the load accordingly, you complete the whole session. That's awesome. That's a win. You're doing more than just about anybody else out there who is doing 24-hour shifts, guaranteed, right? Instead of viewing it as, I was supposed to squat 500 today, right? But I could only squat 455. I suck, right? Big difference in how you view that in terms of the training process. So this has a lot to do with kind of how, if we're going to be goal-oriented, the nature of goals that we use. Are the goals we use performance-based, right? Where you insist on performing, lifting a particular weight? Are they outcome-based, like I'm lifting to win only? If you ain't first, you're last, right? Or are they process-based goals, right? Where I'm going to train all 4 sessions that I'm supposed to do, I'm going to get my conditioning in, et cetera, and that's my win for the week because my life is crazy like this. So that's the way I view this, is just reframing how I view the training process in general.
Yep. I think the only thing I have to add is, like, if you were trying to set yourself up for success, you would want to control or maximize the variables that are under your control as much as possible. So, for example, you're on a 24-hour shift. That doesn't mean, yeah, I'm going to skip 3 different meals and just have, breakfast, for example, before leaving the hospital.
And 3 Red Bulls.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's going to be it. So, if you have your nutrition relatively under control with a health-promoting dietary pattern, your training is set up to allow some flexibility rather than having very rigid processes, and then again, ultimately ascribing less sort of importance to any single session, any single exercise, or any single sort of even input into your training. I mean, I would just assume that you're going to PR anyway, for example.
Yeah.
Like if it's me, I don't work outside of barbell medicine anymore. This is my main baby, but I wish I could get assigned to a night shift because if I go on night shift, I'm going to PR. Historically, whenever I'm on night shift, PR start raining out of nowhere, and I have no idea why. I have no reason to stay up at night now. I'm not a degenerate, so I can't do it. But yeah, I would just assume all of the things being equal that you're going to do great. So having that positive kind of outlook on stuff, good nutrition, and then I don't know that I would recommend naps because I just feel like that's not really going to help. It's like it could help acute performance, but to the extent it compromises sleep drive later on, it's probably net negative. So probably wouldn't do that. Would just go in and train and go on with my life because
that's a good summary of this whole deal.
That's right.
Train and go on with your life.
Yeah, exactly. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming out here, Norfolk, for our first seminar back. Really appreciate it.